live stream lecture. My name is Julian. Hope that you've had a wonderful start to your new year. I'm currently back in my home library in the Pacific Northwest in Spokane, Washington. And for the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to be hosting an introductory lecture, tying together a whole bunch of ideas, but essentially revolving around Adorno's famous quote-unquote maxim, although it's not really a maxim, that to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. We're going to be thinking about poetry, about barbarism, about art, from a variety of different perspectives. That's the essential goal here. Please do drop a comment letting me know where you're joining me from. Always makes me very happy to know that we are a global community of like-minded thinkers. I see someone from the Philippines. Hello, shout out to you. Thank you for joining me. And thank you for the compliment as to my voice. That's very kind of you. Okay, so we're going to be beginning in just a moment, but first I want to say that today is the final day that you can still download my ebook introduction to Slavoj Žižek, the complete collection called The Complete Guide to Žižek. That's going to be available for one more day on my Patreon, and then it's disappearing into the digital ether. So that's coming up. Also, when it comes to my YouTube, so I am going to be deleting my YouTube videos to create a fresh slate, a blank canvas, if you will. However, the lectures are still going to be available on YouTube. So all the live stream lectures from the past 3 years will still be there, fret not. And I really appreciate how many of you have written to me saying that they still go back to the lectures and enjoy them. So thank you for that. Okay, so I want to start this lecture today with a curious case of misremembrance, if you will. I was reading this lovely book. I have it over here. I think I can find it. Yes, one sec. Oh, some of them fell on the floor. I was reading this lovely book, Günter Grass, Der Autor als fragwürdiger Zeuge. The author as a questionable witness. Not an unreliable witness, but a questionable witness. And there's a really interesting passage here. So if you don't know Günter Grass is perhaps the preeminent post-war German author. His most famous work is also his first work, which is The Tin Drum, or Die Blechtrommel. And the way in which Günter Grass described his work is that he wanted to write a work about World War II, about the Nazis, but not in a way that declared it as some kind of overarching historical evil in some absolute sense, but instead to point out the many little petit bourgeois vulgarities that made the rise of the Nazis possible. So it's a very unsparing, unflinching inquiry into a certain way of life that existed in Germany that contributed to the rise of fascism. However, there's a really interesting piece in here where I made a connection that I hadn't made before, which is that Günter Grass says that what led him to become an author in the first place, in fact, he started out as a poet, and before that as a sculptor, what made him want to be an artist was reading Adorno's supposed prohibition against poetry. Now, for context here, Adorno wrote a text in which he declared that to write poetry after Auschwitz was barbaric. And this led to all manner of public furor and speculation, and specifically Adorno was condemned essentially as being anti-art. After all, one could argue that it's precisely after the Holocaust that art would be necessary. It's like Brecht has a wonderful poem about this where, of course, before the Holocaust, Brecht writes, "Will there be singing during the dark times? Yes, there will be singing about the dark times." And yet, and we'll get to this later, Adorno was misunderstood. Adorno's argument was not necessarily against poetry, but we'll get there. But back to Günter Grass. So there's a brilliant passage here where Günter Grass says that he was working as a sculptor, and then he came across Adorno's supposed maxim against poetry. And in an almost reverse psychological interpretation, this made Günter Grass want to write poetry. But what's really interesting is that Grass is reflecting upon his own misinterpretation of Adorno. He said that he and his contemporaries, other young, artistically inclined men in post-war Germany, were angry with Adorno because they believed that he was essentially declaring their work to be barbaric, to be something that should not be done, that was abhorrent, the idea of writing poetry, creating art after Auschwitz. And yet Günter Grass says that the key insight that he had that led to his possibility as an author, his flowering, to put it in cliched terms, as a thinker, was realizing that what appeared to be Adorno's Verbot was in fact Adorno's Gebot. Now, in German, those two words sound very similar, Verbot and Gebot, but translated to English, they're almost the exact opposite. A Verbot is a prohibition, and a Gebot is a commandment. And essentially what Günter Grass said, that the spark that flamed or brought into being his artistic career was precisely this insight that when Adorno characterized poetry after Auschwitz as being barbaric, he didn't mean it as a prohibition against art, but precisely as a commandment to create a new kind of art that could only be written through and within the contradictions of the failure of culture as such, as Adorno puts it. And however, I said that this story for me, this idea, started with a misrecognition, a mismemory, a false memory. And what's interesting is that reading this text by Grass points out that Adorno has this maxim about poetry and barbarism in his Minima Moralia, which is a wonderful text. I think I have it here. Oh, they're all falling on the floor. I don't know if I have it somewhere. I had it a moment ago. Here we go. It was on the floor. Okay. Here we have the verso English translation of Adorno's Minim Oralia, which is a text that contains little, like, half-page long entries, what Adorno calls reflections from damaged life. And Günter Grass mentions that this maxim against barbarism exists in this text, which I don't remember being the case. And so I thought to myself, how is that possible? So I went back and started rereading Minima Moralia, trying to find where it was. In fact, I went on the internet and I saw that someone had cited it as being on page 36, which I couldn't find on page 36. And I checked different editions and I couldn't find it. And then I realized that the reason that I couldn't find it is, of course, the obvious one. It's not actually in this book. This quote by Adorno is so often misinterpreted and cited that we sort of collectively, myself included, forgotten that it is not in the Minima Moralia, but that it is in his book Prisms, which is a short text, not even a book really, in an essay called Culture and Society. But what's curious for me is that there's a certain truth to Günter Grass' misrecollection, because his story, which is the story of understanding that what appeared to be Adorno's Verbot was in fact a Gebot, what appeared to be a prohibition was in fact a commandment as to the necessity of art, therefore started with the misassumption that Adorno was coming up with a simple maxim, a simple prohibition as to how to act, which of course would have been more fitting for the Minima Moralia. And so there's a certain poetic irony that this perhaps the most well-known Adorno proclamation, which of course therefore is not a proclamation, is sort of misremembered as being in the Minima Moralia. But what I'm interested in today, what I'd like to talk about a bit more, is this idea of the function of art, but also the relationship between a prohibition and a commandment, which, if you're a Freudian, you will understand to be one and the same. The idea of the name of the Father, after all, which I'll return to in a moment, is the commandment as prohibition. In other words, it's not the physical father, it's the idea of the father who exists as a barrier for the young person to overcome. And therein, in this prohibition, namely he cannot be overcome, he has to be fought, lies precisely the commandment to live one's life. But we will return to this later. I want to briefly go back to Adorno's idea that to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbarism. Now, when we first encounter this, it appears, like I said before, to be a maxim, a pejorative, if you will, a normative assessment as to the role of poetry. Namely, barbarism equals bad, and so poetry equals bad. But a closer inspection of Adorno's argument reveals that this is not at all how he envisions barbarism. In fact, one could almost argue that he uses barbarism in the sense that today, or in the sense that dandies used to refer to culture as being vulgar. This was like one of Flaubert and Oscar Wilde's affectations, was that they revert, in the same way that Adorno refers to damaged or barbaric life, they would refer to vulgar life, or specifically vulgar times. That the art that came from a vulgar, namely bourgeois for them, society, therefore was a reflection, or in Adornian terms, a reification of said society, and was therefore also inherently vulgar. The task of the dandy and the aesthete and the poet was therefore to, at least in the 19th century, to try to write something that was not considered vulgar, something that was not cliched, as it were. Hence why cliche still exists, at least in today's secular, quote-unquote, post-ideological era. The remnant of this Adornian argument, which is precipitated by the 19th century argument about art, is that one should avoid cliche. In other words, one should avoid saying things that other people have already said or thought in a certain way, that the point of art therefore exists to say something in new ways. Something which I disagree with, but again, not enough time to talk about that right now. When Adorno writes about art and poetry, in light of barbarism, however, it also brings to mind Walter Benjamin's argument about barbarism, which is that instead of seeing civilization and barbarism as binaries, right? Like civilization is how you overcome barbarism. Essentially, Benjamin argues that civilization is simply barbarism in disguise. In other words, that the highest form, the truest form of barbarism is precisely the society that considers itself to be civilized. Of course, from a contemporary, if you will, post-colonial perspective, we can see the truth of this, how it's precisely this idea of civilization that supposedly justifies or seeks to lend credibility or ideological support to the notion that there are lesser or more inferior nations that have to be civilized, the civilizing project, which goes hand in hand with the problematic ethics of the white man's guilt and the white man's burden, etc. White man's burden, not guilt. Civilization, therefore, for Benjamin, is indistinguishable from barbarism. It's not the opposite from barbarism. It's that the very idea or the notion of civilization is itself barbaric. Namely, the very suggestion that we have a binary, if you will, linear spectrum between the barbaric and the civilized spectator is itself a barbaric notion. Which, to put it in more contemporary critical terms, this means that the idea of barbarism is the product of a civilized gaze, that it's precisely through the lens of the ideology that upholds the notion of civilization that one sees the barbaric, but not only sees it, but the barbaric becomes necessitated, becomes constitutive to the upholding of the ideal of civilization. And so it's not only in the name of civilization that atrocities are committed, but it's precisely that civilization exists as the highest form of barbarity, at least according to Adorno. On an aside, though, I should say, as someone who enjoys antiquity, I've always liked the notion, I can't remember who exactly said it, if this was, this is where it's an aside, so I can't back this up. I remember learning this in school. It was not Cicero, it was not Seneca, so it must be one of the philosophers who said that it was precisely the barbaroi, the foreigners, the outsiders, who could speak the truth of Rome. That to be in Rome meant that you were blinded by its ideology, but it was the barbaros who could speak on the condition of Rome most truthfully, which of course then segs into the idea that the very notion of the barbaros as being some kind of unified segment of existence that lies against the autochthonous, supposedly autochthonous population of Rome, which never existed in that sense, is precisely the truth of Rome, the inherent contradiction that lies within the idea of the Roman Empire is the creation of the idea of barbarism, and so on and so forth. And in contemporary terms, one can see this also, how those tombs of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, or HBO's Rome, etc., always contain some mildly reactionary contents as to this notion of a civilizational decline that are then supposedly refracted within the current moment, etc. Even the very narrative of East versus West, of the clash of civilizations, to put it in Huntington's terms, which was a key ideological supplement to the war on terror in the early noughts, which for someone my age is hard to believe that that's already 20 years ago, is part of this Adornian, or at least what Adorno and Benjamin have in mind when they write about civilization as barbarism. And so when Adorno writes that it is barbaric to write poetry after Auschwitz, in part what he means is that life after Auschwitz is barbaric. That to continue living, to keep on going, to write and to think and to be happy and to exist as a person, not just in light of Auschwitz, but knowing fully well that the society in which one lives and the culture, which is a key term for Adorno, the culture in which one lives is the very results of the world that created the possibility of, or if you will, the impossibility, which is precisely the condition of possibility for Auschwitz, that it could not be imagined. To keep on living in this world feels like a crime. It feels barbaric. And yet this barbarism is precisely reflected back within the barbarism of quote-unquote high civilization. It's something that I find quite relatable. I think everybody, to simplify, I think everybody has moments where they're confronted with the horror that exists in the world. And they ask themselves, how can I be happy after this, knowing what has happened? Think about it in terms of Israel-Palestine right now. How can you go on living knowing what is happening in Gaza? How can you go on about your day? These are questions that I think are very common, because one starts to think that not to think about it or to speak about it all the time is therefore a kind of crime, or that one becomes complicit. And yet, in many ways, it's precisely using this to do something, to teach, to write, to create, to paint, to organize, to become a part of your community, your politics, to do something is therefore necessitated, I would argue, instead of simply falling back into a kind of pseudo-activity. In fact, one of the traps of contemporary life is that we try to avoid this gnawing awareness of the horrors that are committed in our name, supposedly, by engaging in a whole host of pseudo-activities that give us the feeling of having agency, yet fundamentally deprive us thereof. Namely, that simply allow us to keep posting more and more regurgitative content that therefore fuels the attention economy. Therefore, the question, what is to be done after Auschwitz? How does one write poetry? And by poetry here, one should generalize into art and thinking and if you will, the very humanist, emancipatory ideal of what it means to be alive. One should expand this idea into how to create in the world that we live in today, how to do something in which the very idea of being a creator simply means to fuel the creator economy. Now, here I want to make a brief diversion, but a necessary one, I believe, to the writing of Boris Groys, who is a art critic and theorist. In fact, again, the book's on the floor because they all fell on the floor. Here's a book I would recommend. It's called Art Power by Boris Groys. Quite a lovely cover. This is from MIT Press. They do beautiful editions. Boris Groys has a really interesting piece, very provocative, of course, as is his wont, which he calls Hitler's art theory. And it sort of starts with a speech that Hitler gives in 1937, in which Hitler says, or invects against art critics, art theorists. In fact, Hitler essentially says that one of the signs of civilizational decline is the emergence and rise of art theory. Of course, again, here we can see this reactionary motif of civilizational decline in its most stark form, namely in Hitler's speech. And this leads Boris Groys to start thinking about, what is Hitler's aesthetic ideal? In other words, what is Hitler's art theory? Can we take Hitler's aesthetic project seriously? In fact, one should, according to Boris Groys. And the way in which Groys summarizes it is, he says, Hitler's aesthetic theory is essentially the creation of the heroic through art. But specifically, he summarizes it in what I think is a really nice thing, which is that Hitler's aesthetic project is not to fuel the creation of art, but to fuel the creation of the public, which for Hitler specifically is the creation of the spectator. In other words, the artistic project is not so much the production of a certain type of art, but instead the a certain type of spectator, who appreciates the right kind of art. Therefore, in the appreciation of said art, contributes to the quote-unquote eternal, undying essence of the heroic within the German people. And here Groys has in his next article, he has a really interesting inversion of this. He writes about socialist realism in light of fascist art. And he says that socialist realism actually is almost a misnomer, because often it's easy for writers to say, well, socialist realism and fascist, German fascist art are fundamentally the same. They both contribute to the idealization of a certain notion of patriotism and collective power, etc., right? This is the standard way in which it's often interpreted. And Boris Groys kind of rejects this. He says, socialist realism was never about the depiction of what was really in the world. In fact, if one judges it by this aesthetic criteria, that it depicts what exists in the world, it fundamentally falls flat. It's not realist. The way that Groys describes socialist realism, which I think is quite beautiful, he says, it is realist in form, but idealist in content. Now, what does it mean to be realist in form? Well, one would imagine that to be realist in form is simply to depict the world that as is. But since socialist realism doesn't do that, then this doesn't seem to apply. And this is where Boris Groys argues, by means of going back to socialist realist texts from the Soviet era, that essentially the enemy for realism from a social realist perspective had two enemies, namely naturalism and formalism. This means that the form of social realism was to be against formalism. What does that mean? Well, the formalism of depicting the world as is, as an eternal truth, as representative of an ideal, was precisely what the social realists were against. This notion that one can find an essence of the people that could be depicted. Instead, it's that the social realists wanted to depict a public that as of yet did not exist, if you will, a utopian vision of society that did not correspond to the currently existing formal structures, but precisely lay within the possibilities imminent to the contradictions of the society as it was historically unfolding. This is why social realism would be realist in form, but idealist in content. Namely, its form was an anti-formalism which allowed for the idealism of its content. Hence why the relationship between form and content would become so important to the modernists coming out of the Russian Revolution. Of course, we're playing around with timelines here. Russian Revolution and Soviet era are not the same, but again, that would be for another lecture. I am trying to compress here. I'm trying to toe the line. We only have 45 minutes after all. So what Boris Groys basically argues here is that what Hitler was interested in from an aesthetic perspective was the creation of a public that was supposed to reflect the eternal ideals of German heroism. In other words, the public had to look at the art and find itself to be commensurate with the ideals and the project of the art. And if they were considered to be not the right spectators, they were of course discarded. They were violently removed. Whereas the idea of social realism within the Soviet world, which of course belay its own violence, was precisely the positing of a world that did not yet exist, that was not an eternal reflection of the quote-unquote Russian people, hence there's no relationship to nationalism or patriotism from this perspective, but precisely a utopian gesture of what humanity could look like. Now, if we go back to the idea of civilization here, one can see how socialist realism is actually quite antithetical to the notion of the traditional Enlightenment humanist aesthetic project. If the traditional Enlightenment humanist project is that art is supposed to elevate people, is supposed to bring out their better self, and therefore to tap into the eternal values of virtue, etc., one can see how Hitler's aesthetic project is in fact much more indebted to the tradition of the Enlightenment than it is to what socialist realist art would be positing, which is anti-humanist, anti-Enlightenment. And now we can actually go back and understand properly Adorno's argument in his critique of Enlightenment together with Adorno, by which he says that it's precisely the Enlightenment that exists as the fundamental myth that fuels the reification of what he calls damaged life. In other words, in the same way that we see civilization as the highest form of barbarism, for Adorno, the Enlightenment myth is the ideological supplement that allows for this barbarism. Hence, essentially, if you will, to simplify, if the Hitlerian, if such a thing could even exist because it's not an ism, the Hitlerian art project, aesthetic theory, is the outcome, the necessary consequence of the Enlightenment, then to treat Hitler as a historical anomaly who cannot but be understood as an exception to the rule is precisely barbaric, precisely a suppression of the internal contradictions that allowed for the rise of fascism in the first place. And now, my friends, we can go back to Günter Grass, who makes the exact same argument after reading Adorno, which is to say, after reading Adorno, I realized that what appeared as a Verbot, a prohibition against poetry, was in fact a Gebot, a commandment, which meant that the art that I had to write was the art of the historical circumstances, not by which fascism emerged as a historical anomaly of excessive absolute evil, but precisely how it emerged from within the contradictions of the supposedly enlightened, humanistic, bourgeois German identity. That's the connection. I find that beautiful. I find it really interesting. Like, I already admired Günter Grass, but to see that idea that he had makes it so much more interesting to me. And this is why Slavoj Žižek, for example, says that one should actually resist Adorno's argument, or at least expand upon it. Instead of saying after Auschwitz poetry is barbaric, Slavoj Žižek argues that after Auschwitz prose is barbaric. That it's precisely prose that continues to push a certain comfortable ideological narrative about the supposed virtue of human civilization and the progress of national identity, which one can find even today, I would argue, in the idea of politically correct identity politics-driven prose. But that it's precisely poetry, which Adorno singles out as negative, that it's precisely poetry that can draw out the formal structures, the impossibilities of language as such. And if you will, like, for example, you can find many examples that would support this argument. Think about, like, Jack Kerouac. Jack Kerouac's On the Road, which is a beautiful novel in many ways, is not reflective of what happened during Auschwitz. There's a great line where it says, I think, where Truman Capote says that Jack Kerouac didn't learn how to write, he learned how to type. The stream of consciousness writing, this writing in one exhaustive session, is therefore precisely the idea of trying to lift oneself out of the historical conditions by which the artistic project emerges. It's a very insistent notion that one can write as if only from the heart, from a kind of ur-consciousness, as it were, and therein, in the absolutely particular, to reflect some kind of universal emanation. Now, of course, this too is in relationship to Auschwitz, it's just not made specific in that way. And so even Kerouac's writing is a way of trying to overcome this problem of the aesthetic project, which had become suspicious since the Enlightenment. And think about it, like, I think this is actually quite important, the relationship between the Enlightenment and the idea of humanism, that art was supposed to have as its fundamental purpose to lift up the human soul, to make it more virtuous, to instruct it. That art essentially, therefore, is not only normative in nature, but also moralistic in some sense. The extreme and the perverted logic of fascism, of course, to distinguish between degenerate art and virtuous art or patriotic art is of course, the logical outcome of this thinking, which is a normative suggestion that if there is good art that is supposed to make you a better person and part of a better society, then there has to be bad or degenerate art that reflects all that shouldn't be created. This is something I think that we see even today in a repressed form emerging through the entire culture war about identity politics. The question as to whether a text should serve to educate the masses as to the proper behavior. The politically correct texts that we have today that essentially are texts that are written for white people to learn about race often therefore have less to do with an actual engagement with race, with critical race theory or whatever way you will, but precisely the assuaging of a certain internalized liberal white guilt as to the gaps in their education, etc. If the central notion of political correctness, as Slavoj Žižek argues, is to avoid giving offense, then these books exist precisely so as to assure the white audience that they have not given offense. In fact, I haven't seen it come out yet, but I saw a trailer recently for a movie that is about this right thing. I think it's called like American Author, American Critic or something. It's quite beautiful, in which we have an African-American author who doesn't want to write a book about race, who then finds himself writing a bestseller on race that sells very well to white people because it gives them all the cliches that they imagine about the African-American experience within the United States. It's, of course, a complicated question, but a question that nevertheless exists within the shadow, or if you will, within the light, raised by the Adornian idea of poetry after Auschwitz. What is the function of art after a previously hitherto unthinkable, and therefore precisely possible, historical crime? Now, I wanted to briefly talk, because we still have time about this, I wanted to talk about commandment versus prohibition. It's one of those things that you could accuse me perhaps of being a stupid Hegelian dialectician or whatever, but the relationship between a commandment, namely you should do X, and a prohibition, you should not do X, is quite interesting to me. I'll give you an example. There's a beautiful story, well known by Kafka. It's called The Verdict. Again, I actually have a copy of it here. I got this from the library, mostly because I think this is such a great cover. This is from Pushkin Press. It's a reissued collection of Kafka stories with the misleading title, The Unhappiness of Being a Single Man, which is a one-page story. I could literally read it to you right here. It's like one page. It's actually, okay, maybe we'll have a little reading session. Is that too silly? Probably. The unhappiness of being a single man. It seems a terrible thing to stay single for good, to become an old man who, if he wants to spend the evening with other people, has to stand on his dignity and ask someone for an invitation. To be ill and spend weeks looking out at the corner of your bed in an empty room, always to say goodbye at the door, never to squeeze your way up the stairs beside your wife, to live in a room where the side doors lead only to other people's apartments, to carry your dinner home in one hand, to be forced to admire children you don't know, and not to be allowed to just keep repeating, I don't have any, to model your appearance and behavior on one or two bachelors you remember from childhood. That's how it's going to be. Except that in reality, both today and in the future, you'll actually be standing there yourself with a body and a real head, as well as a forehead, which you can use your hand to slap. Okay, that is the one-page story that this book advertises being the central idea, the unhappiness of being a single man. Still worth getting. But the reason that I got this from the library is because these Pushkin Press editions are just lovely. Look at that. Look at that lovely cover. But this contains within it not just like the penal colony and before the law, but also The Verdict. Also has a hunger artist. Hunger artist is one of my all-time favorite Kafka stories. It's about a man who is essentially part of a freak show, part of a circus, and his skill is that he doesn't eat. He doesn't eat for 40 days, and after 40 days, he's force-fed, and then the whole thing starts over again. It's very similar to Guillermo del Toro's adaptation of Nightmare Alley, actually, in which the freak is a key component. Anyway, at the end of The Hunger Artist, the man is replaced by a more interesting attraction, again, which is reminiscent of the Coen brothers' Ballad of Buster Scrooge, which has a similar short story, also very Kafkaesque. And the man is asked, why don't you eat? Is it that, like, why don't you eat? What joy do you find in not eating? Because this is the entire man's artistic project, is denying himself. As Lacan wrote, if you deny the body, you become denial embodied. This man enjoys the surplus of being denial embodied. And he writes the beautiful words. He says, it's not so much that I didn't want to eat. It's that I could find nothing that I found worth eating. It's such a beautifully dark, Kafkaesque idea. It's that it's not that you didn't want to live. It's that you couldn't find something worth living for. It's so great. But anyway, the story here, which is the story The Verdict, is one of Kafka's most famous also. I mean, they're all famous, that's why they're collected here. In The Verdict, we see an almost autobiographical fantasy, or nightmare, if you will, about Kafka's relationship to his father, which was infamously broken. Kafka's father to his letter is devastating. Perhaps there's never been a man who suffered more under the name of the father, as it were. And in this story, the young man has a friend, and he writes to his friend, and etc. He believes himself to be fairly independent and happy and healthy, etc. And then he goes to his elderly father, and through a series of revelations, the elderly father tells him that he is in fact been corresponding with his friend all along, and that his impending marriage is not going to happen. It's all a bit like a nightmare. But essentially, the elderly father, and this is the key moment in the story, the elderly father, at a certain point, prophesizes the end of his son, of the narrator. He basically says, you are going to drown. You are not going to get married. You are going to drown. And in this moment, there's a dreamlike, nightmarish logic in the story, where as soon as this verdict, hence the title, has been declared by the father, the narrator essentially leaves the house, walks up to a canal, and drowns himself. The father says he will drown. The son, like an empty automata, walks over to the canal and drowns himself. It's a very jarring and stunning ending. And there's many different interpretations, but from a Freudian perspective, it's about the name of the father. The name of the father isn't the father figure, but it's the symbol of father. The father who exists, therefore, both as prohibition and commandment. Namely, the father who is the barrier to life, the person you resist, the person you try to best, the person you want to, in some ways, measure yourself against, a kind of necessary barrier, is therefore both that which holds you back, but also becomes the preconditions upon which you live your life. In other words, the autonomous assertion of agency and free will exists against the backdrop of this idea of the name of the father. And the crucial, quote-unquote, mistake, if you want to put it in normative terms, which I wouldn't, of the narrator in Kafka's The Verdict is that he misconstrues the fatherly Gebot, you will drown, as a verbot against life itself. But what's key here, and this is what I want to stress, is that the narrator's self-imposed, or not self-imposed, self-actualized drowning, the father declares he will drown and he drowns himself, is nevertheless a kind of act of resistance. Which is to say, instead of choosing to live his own life in the shadow of the name of the father, the impossible double bind by which his own autonomous agency exists only through the refraction of that which he does not want to be, he does something radically alien to that notion, which is to submit completely to the father, to completely suspend his being, and therefore make it subservient to the father, and therefore to symbolically cease to exist. But in a weird way, in the same way that we have this like almost sublime Kantian notion that hope exists only where all hope has been lost, you could make the argument that when the character drowns himself, he has escaped the bind of the name of the father. That therefore this death is a symbolic death that has been staged from which he can arise, potentially. Now, first of all, I should say, hopefully, I'm going to be politically correct here, but trigger warning, the story I've just told you already contains scenes of suicide, etc., which don't drown yourself. This should go without saying, hopefully. What's beautiful here, though, is actually, so this idea, right, which is that the character makes himself completely subservient to the father, and therefore accepts the father's declaration as to his non-existence as a death sentence, which he himself is to then mete out, is something that I actually found recently quite beautifully written about in Dostoevsky. I was reading Dostoevsky's The Adolescent, which was a recent translation. It originally came out as The Accidental Family, or even better title, very Stefan Zweigian, Raw Youth. It was a serialized story, so it had different names. But the Everyman Library edition is called The Adolescent. I haven't quite finished it yet, actually. But if you're interested in a introduction to Dostoevsky, I'd recommend this. And this is Critical Lives, is a great series from Reaction Publishers on Dostoevsky. It gives you a basic introduction to all his themes and his works. But Dostoevsky has a beautiful observation in The Adolescent, which is that he says, I don't trust people who give themselves completely to God, because he suspects that there is an element of pride in it, which is to say, instead of being subject to others, if you make yourself completely subject to God, it's like you've said, nobody is worth being subject to except the highest, except God. Therefore, Dostoevsky, in a very, I wouldn't even call it ironic or cynical, but very brutal way, detects within the supposed highest form of worship, complete submission to God, a mortal sin, namely pride. That to give oneself completely to the highest is therefore a sin for Dostoevsky. This is classic Dostoevsky mind games, right? The sin of pride would therefore be to completely give yourself to God so as to not risk giving yourself to others. It's a self-protective act. Essentially what Dostoevsky is arguing, it's very provocative, even though it's an aside, is that the complete submission to God, like entering a monastery, for example, is a form of narcissism. It's a self-protective act. It's saying, I want to exist above the world. I can't deal with the barbarism of existence. I have to look away. In fact, this was one of Dostoevsky's complaints about Turgenev, who he reconciled with, but for a long time really hated. He wrote that Turgenev pretends to be an enlightened figure who cares for others. But fundamentally, Turgenev can't even look at an execution while it's taking place. Here he's referencing a passage in Turgenev's writing where Turgenev says that, you know, he can't look at an execution taking place because it's too graphic, right? He's a sensitive soul. And Dostoevsky is very mad about this. He writes, everything you need to know about Turgenev, Ivan Turgenev, is that he thinks he's better than the darkness of the world, that he thinks he can look away from it, that he's trying to protect his sensibilities and the sensibilities of the public, which Dostoevsky finds to be vulgar. Now, don't get me wrong, Dostoevsky isn't arguing that we should simply hone in on the worst, which itself would be exploitative, right? If you wrote a book that was just about beheadings, it would be a form of entertainment, it would become spectacle, it would become exploitative. Instead, Dostoevsky says that he's suspicious of anybody who believes that the horror of the world is something one has to turn away from. Dostoevsky believes that one has to look at it directly in the eye, that one has to confront it, that one has to deal with this horror. Because any other life, which is therefore disavowed life, life that pretends like the horror doesn't exist, is therefore a lie. And Dostoevsky's idea of truth, therefore, is precisely to expose the fundamental lie that exists at the heart of society, that it is higher or more virtuous, that it exists as a more elevated stance apropos the barbarism of the violence that takes shape around us. In other words, Dostoevsky has an aesthetic project that at its heart contains a criticism or a critique that is almost a precedent, if you will, although at least in spirit a precedent, to Adorno and Walter Benjamin's critique of civilization and barbarism. And I think there's something quite important about this, especially from a contemporary perspective, where we focus, to some extent rightfully so, on, you know, meditation and taking care of oneself, etc. But this shouldn't come at the cost of knowing and understanding the world and the atrocities and the complications of the world. There's a great line about that from Bertolt Brecht, who says, "Pity the nation that needs heroes," which is an implicit critique of fascism. Remember, early in the lecture I said that Boris Groys argues that the Hitlerian aesthetic project is the creation of a heroic race. That this idea of a hero who can be a hero in your stead is precisely the problem. That life fundamentally may have moments of heroism, but the heroic is never that which is outrageously, normatively brilliant. It's complicated. It's more heroic to accept and understand that life is both beautiful and painful, that the shadow and the light work together, that any artistic project that believes that art exists only to elevate existence. Therefore, fundamentally doesn't understand that art is about reconciling oneself with pain, with suffering. In fact, if you've lost someone in your family, whether it's to sickness or an accident or whatever, often it can be very soothing to read other people's accounts of their pain and their suffering. That what a lot of art does, especially interesting literature and poetry, is that it shows us that the human experience isn't blunt. It's not black and white. It's not good versus bad. It's that sadness can persist in beauty, that there are ways to make the world worth living, not by means of getting rid of evil and pain and suffering, but by understanding that this too is part of the intricate experience of life. There's a beautiful passage about this, I think, in Gustave Flaubert's November. Here I have the Fisher version of it, which is his, essentially it's a study, it's a shorter version of what would become his sentimental education. And it's about a young man. And it's a young man who essentially feels that he can't be in the world. He can't trust the world because behind every beautiful sight lies something disgusting and gross. It's like so much has to be repressed in order to keep on existing. It's like he can never have unadulterated joy. It's a beautiful passage where the young author, who feels that he is prematurely aged, it's like he knows of the world, writes that he feels like a house whose walls have developed moss before the construction has even been completed. And I find that really moving because I think if you're online today, especially as a young person, and you're confronted so viscerally with the absolute abyss, the horrors of the world, the violence we inflict upon each other, it can feel like one wants to turn away completely. Like one has been spoiled before one has been ruined before one even got to enjoy the supposed ignorance of bliss. This is something that I really struggled with when I was young as well. The more I read, the more I learned, the more I watched what was happening in the world, the more I understood that everything appeared to be a lie. Everything appeared to be predicated on suffering. That every civilization was built on the ruins of another, as it were. And yet, as I matured, I realized that the bliss of ignorance, right? The famous maxim, ignorance is bliss, isn't bliss. It's a simulacrum of an emotion, which is to say, if you are the pure soul who hasn't dipped your toe into the water of despair, then you're not really living. That the urge to protect ourselves from pain and suffering, and the knowledge of pain and suffering inflicted on our behalf, to remain an unblemished soul, is therefore precisely to not live at all. And to go back to where we started with Theodor Adorno's Minim, Oralia, when Adorno writes about damaged life, he doesn't mean that there was a pure life which became damaged. He means the exact opposite. He means that the idea of an undamaged life is itself damaged life. The idea of pure, blissful, happy consumerism that is never affected by the outcomes by the consequences of our actions, this is damaged life. Whereas understanding the historical constellations through which injustice and suffering persists, this is a rich life. A rich life is to be able to look at these things and try to understand them and reconcile oneself with them. Therefore, in the same way that the idea of civilization is the ultimate barbarism, Adorno writes that the idea of an undamaged life is precisely a damaged life. And so to end on a slightly more positive note, the point therefore is that what appears to be Adorno's Verbot, his prohibition against art, is in fact a Gebot. It's a commandment to create art. To see art, and for Adorno specifically poetry, is the only way in which this contradictory experience can be brought to bear. That, as the almost cliched aphorism goes, art and fiction are the lie that tell the truth. Whereas reality and the supposed harmony of existence is precisely the truth which presents itself to you as a lie. And so Adorno is essentially saying, you should write poetry, you should create, but you should let go of the idea of writing art, of writing poetry and creating art that is supposed to elevate the soul, that exists in a political, historical vacuum. Art as a supposed emanation from the gods. Instead, it's also an invitation to start understanding that art is never something that is created in isolation. It is always a reflection of its time, but perhaps more importantly, the time that came before it and the time that is yet to come. And to understand this is to liberate oneself from the constrictions of an ideology that tells you that the highest form of happiness is simply to be a consumer who can go home and watch Netflix all day, which I'm not against watching Netflix. There's a lot of good art on Netflix. And so what Adorno calls damaged life is precisely the idea of an undamaged life. The reason that Adorno calls poetry barbaric is that art comes from barbaric precedents. And once we understand that, we have set ourselves free. We can create once again. That is Adorno on why you can't write poetry after Auschwitz. But I hope that I've also introduced you to some other text. If you'd like to have a list of the books that I've talked about, I've posted them to my Substack, where I post a weekly reading list for $5 subscribers. You can find that by going to julianphilosophy.substack.com. Or if you'd like to download all of my lectures and my ebooks, please go to www.patreon.com/JulianPhilosophy. Above all, I want to say thank you for joining me here today on this Monday morning. It's such a pleasure to be able to create new connections between existing texts and ideas, and I really hope that this will in some way stimulate you to develop an appetite for your own reading and study and discussions. So from myself to you, wherever you are in the world, I want to send you all the readerly inspiration in the world. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon. Bye, guys.